All right, welcome everyone to part 3 of Cynthia's trilogy on C.S. Lewis's science fiction trilogy. I didn't call it the space trilogy this time, Cynthia. I'm getting better. We have already voyaged through the mind of C.S. Lewis and opened up new vistas to his personality, the world that he was living in, the fight that he was waging with bad ideas that were beginning to really emerge and take hold of the zeitgeist. And this is something which he is, I think, very undervalued for. I mean, he's known and valued for a lot of very good things, but this specific epistemological battle is something which has passed over or under the radar of a lot of people, including myself. It's been an amazing learning experience, just being able to receive briefings from Cynthia over the past few weeks. And my mind has really, really exploded. And I hope everyone will go through a similar experience. Cynthia, you have a lot to go through. I know that. It's all yours.
Okay. Just trying to maximize. Everyone can see it okay?
Sure.
Okay, so, right, for anyone who is just jumping on right now, this is the third part. So there is, C.S. Lewis wrote 3 books that were a sci-fi trilogy. And I've done 2 previous classes, which you can find on the Rising Tide Foundation YouTube page. So the previous week, we went through, especially comparing C.S. Lewis against H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon. And C.S. Lewis pretty much wrote Out of the Silent Planet largely as a reaction to the kind of ideas that H.G. Wells was putting forward in that book, which are quite disturbing and have a lot of similarity to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Aldous Huxley most definitely was inspired by the work of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, especially in Russell's Scientific Outlook, which again, I go through in part 1. And then part 2 was C.S. Lewis's Paralandra, Towards a Beatific or Miserific Vision. That one is much more philosophical in its nature. This part is going to be very different. They're all quite different from each other. This one is going to be rather ambitious on C.S. Lewis's part. It's going to tackle transhumanism, the occult, and Merlin, amongst other things. So I'll do my best to give people a good overview, but the book goes through quite a bit. So I cannot put everything into this class because it would be extremely long, but we'll go through what I think are the focal points, especially C.S. Lewis, again, as I talked about more in detail in part 1, was the head of the Socratic club at Oxford, and he very much believed in the Socratic method when coming to an investigation of whether something partakes in truth or not. And so he very much goes through several layers of what governs the philosophy, the ideological outlook of these people who are promoting certain currents, especially in science he's focusing on in this trilogy, and what is governing them to think that this needs to be a necessary conclusion according to their outlook, and what are the real life characters that have actually been shaping this. Because even though it's science fiction, as H.G. Wells also, you know, he was not writing these things for entertainment. It was clear that they were readying people for what was going to come. So at the very start of C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, he quotes Sir David Lindsay's poem from the Dialogue, which describes the Tower of Babel. He writes, "The shadow of that hideous strength, 6 mile and more it is of length." And that is the title of the book. So I just want people to kind of have that in the back of their minds as we're going through the book. And Hugh, sorry, you're making a lot of noise.
Sorry. Sorry.
And you know, just keep that in the back of your mind. And as we go forward, at the very end, we will address this. And for those who don't know, the Tower of Babel, it is in reference to a section in Genesis, which I will now allow our professional narrator, Hugh, to read.
Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth.
So again, according to this story, a united human race speaking a single language had migrated eastward, comes to the land of Shinar, and they agreed to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And again, like I said, keep it in the back of your mind as to why C.S. Lewis would have decided to name the book this and start out with that quote, and we will address it at the end of the lecture. So this is artwork by J.P. Cokes, by the way. I don't know if he was inspired to try to get funding for a movie, an anime movie on That Hideous Strength, which is, if that's the case, people should totally support that, because I think it's a very cool idea, cool style for a movie on That Hideous Strength. It's very much written in a way that would make a very good movie. So That Hideous Strength, it starts off with this couple, Jane and Mark Studdock. And Jane is a graduate of literature, and Mark is a sociologist. And they've been recently married, it seems less than a year, and they're having marital problems. Jane also is starting to have these weird dreams. And we realize that one of her dreams, she dreams a super weird dream of an Arab-looking prisoner under death sentence who's in discussion with a man who's wearing the pince-nez, which you see in this picture here. And they're speaking French. She doesn't understand French very well, so it's an odd thing to have in a supposed dream. And then the visitor with the pince-nez all of a sudden grabs the Arab's prisoner's head and makes a sharp turn and removes it. Then the dream switches over and you see a different head. This one is attached to a body with a reddish white beard covered with earth. It belongs to this old man that people are digging up in some kind of churchyard, a sort of ancient British druidical kind of man in a long mantle, which is the kind of, hooded cape that goes all the way down. Later, the day after, Jane reads about the execution of a man called Alcasan in the paper, who was a distinguished radiologist who had a very promising career ahead of him, except that he had poisoned his wife. And so he had been executed. He was supposed to have been executed, although her dream said otherwise. So Jane figured that, she must have heard about him before, and that was why she had that weird dream. Mark works for Brockton College, which is a made-up college that C.S. Lewis has concocted here, which is under the college is under the University Exto. They're both made up. However, there are constant references to Oxford and Cambridge being their competitors. And I think that, and just to remind people too, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, they both went to Oxford. They were very familiar with that kind of crowd. And later on, C.S. Lewis became a Don professor at Cambridge, teaching English literature of the medieval period. So they're very familiar with the kind of, you could say, ideas that would shape policy that were coming out of Oxford and Cambridge, which a lot of it was not good stuff. So I think it's pretty obvious that he's made up Bracton and Exto to represent this, but in a safe way. So Mark has recently been promoted to receive a fellowship. He's moving up in the Bracton College, and we realize that Mark has this problem that C.S. Lewis has identified as desiring to enter the inner ring, which I'll say more about it as we go throughout this lecture, because it is a major theme of this. Mark also realizes that the only reason why he received the fellowship was because of Devine, who, for people who were there for part 1 of this series, he was the guy along with Weston who had kidnapped Ransom and went and took him to Malacandra. So Devine is now back, but he's Lord Feverston now. He's moved up in the ranks. And he has a lot of influence with Bracton College. He also has a lot of influence in London with Parliament and all of this, and the city of London. For those who know, you know, that's not a very good place. I don't have time to say more about that, but I wrote a paper on it for those who want to look more into it. So Mark realizes that he got this position not because of the paper he wrote. So all of the candidates, they had to write papers to apply for the position. And Mark's paper was inferior to other people's papers. The man Curry, who is now his like overseer at Bracton College, is even telling him this, but that Devine basically intervened and said, but Mark is the kind of man that we are looking for. Again, Mark is a sociologist. That's an important an important thing that C.S. Lewis wants to stress. You can go ahead, Hugh.
You would never have guessed from the tone of Stolak's, that is Mark's, reply what intense pleasure he derived from Curry's use of the pronoun we. So very recently, he had been an outsider, watching the proceedings of what he then called Curry and his gang with awe and with little understanding, and making at college meetings short, nervous speeches which never influenced the course of events. Now he was inside, and Curry and his gang had become we, or the progressive element in college. It had all happened quite suddenly and was still sweet in the mouth.
So the progressive element is the first inner ring that Mark has entered. And the inner ring is basically, you know, that selective group that looks like they know something that everyone else does. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So yeah, the inner ring is that selective group that I don't think it needs a lot of explaining in its most simplistic terms. Everyone kind of knows, you know, what that is. And so in this college, the inner ring is the progressive element, which is basically in opposition to the traditionalist schools. And the progressive element we'll come to see is very much about a kind of new science, which has been really they feel suffocated thus far because of red tape, bureaucracy, you know, making people really upset about things that might seem immoral or unethical or illegal. And so they're trying to create reform because you can't have progress if you're constantly stuck in the old morality, the old traditions of what is right and wrong. So Exto University, we realize, is working closely now with the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. The acronym is NICE. And we find out that Nice is into doing vivisections on animals and experiments on humans. And I think that Tavistock didn't exist by name when C.S. Lewis was working on this. The book was published in 1945 and Tavistock officially existed in 1947. But most definitely there was Tavistock type experimentation going on during World War II, and William Sargent is a very good example of that. Again, you can refer to my Huxley series papers on my Substack if you want to know more about that. So it just goes to show how much C.S. Lewis really understood what was creeping out of World War II and was very astute in trying to warn the public of what were the kind of two choices, the two futures that we had in front of us at the time, and which now we are definitely living one of those versions. So the Tavistock Institute, for people who are not familiar with it, it is the Tavistock of Human Relations is a British not-for-profit organization, blah, 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 applies to social science to contemporary issues and problems. So again, recall, Mark is a sociologist, and sociology is a social science, according to Wikipedia, that focuses on society, human, social behavior, patterns of social relationships, social interactions, aspects of culture associated with everyday life. It claims to use various methods of empirical investigation, critical analysis, develop a body of knowledge about social order and social change. While some sociologists conduct research that may be applied directly to social policy and welfare, others focus primarily on refining the theoretical understanding of social processes and phenomenological method. Subject matter can range from micro-level analyses of society, individual interaction and agency, to macro-level analyses, that is, of systems and social structure. Traditional focuses of sociology include social stratification, social class, social mobility, religion, secularization, law, sexuality, gender, and deviance. As all spheres of human activity are affected by the interplay between social structure and individual agency, sociology has gradually expanded its focus to other subjects and institutions such as health and the institution of medicine, economy, military, punishment, and systems of control, the internet, sociology of education, social capital, and the role of social activity in the development of scientific knowledge. So that kind of encompasses a lot, I would say.
Cynthia?
Yeah?
Just quick, the Tavistock Clinic actually did exist in 1920, and then the Institute was created in afterwards. But so this is something which C.S. Lewis was definitely directly looking at, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. So the clinic, was it public?
Yeah, it was set up in 1920 under I forget who, but yeah, it was
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I definitely need to look more into that in terms of like the difference between the two of them. But Mark is thus at a meeting at Bracton College, and they're under discussion for selling this wood, the Bragdon wood, which is an ancient wood. And the Nice Institute very much wants to purchase this wood. And if Bracton refuses to sell it, then they're basically threatening that they're going to take their business elsewhere. And for some reason, everybody really wants the partnership of Nice associated with Extau. They, feel like they're in competition with it with Oxford and Cambridge, which C.S. Lewis mentions. Okay, you can go ahead, Hugh.
The Nice was the first fruit of that constructive fusion between the state and the laboratory, on which so many thoughtful people based their hopes of a better world. It was to be free from almost all the tiresome restraints, red tape was the word its supporters used, which have hitherto hampered research in this country. It was also largely free from the restraints of economy, for, as it was argued, a nation which can spend so many millions a day on a war can surely afford a few millions a month on productive research in peacetime. The building proposed for it was one which would make a quite noticeable addition to the skyline of New York. The staff was to be enormous and their salaries princely. Persistent pressure and endless diplomacy on the part of the Senate of Edgestow had lured the new institute away from Oxford, from Cambridge, from London. It had thought of all these in turn as possible scenes for its labors. At times, the progressive element in Edgestow had almost despaired, but success was now practically certain. If the nice would get the necessary land, Bragdon would, it would come to Edgestow. And once it came, then, as everyone felt, things would at last begin to move.
So Jane bumps into this woman named Mrs. Dimble. She's like out in the Extow town, and Mrs. Dimble is the wife of Cecil Dimble, who is a fellow of Northumberland, which is another college. And he had been Jane's tutor for her last years as a student. Again, remember, Jane is was a student of literature. So you can kind of see there's a clear kind of message here of like the sociology side versus the literature side that you're going to see form in the book. And what did I want to say? So she finds out through Mrs. Dimble that the house that they're living in, it's on the grounds that's owned by the Extow University, and they're going to be evicted pretty much, today or the day after. It's like going really quickly. And there's these massive construction teams that are coming into town. They're not local people. They don't know where these people really came from, but they're all being employed by the Nice Institute, and they seem, rather bizarre. They almost seem a little bit criminal in their behavior. And then there's this discussion that comes between them where the legend of King Arthur comes up.
During lunch, Dr. Dimble talked about the Arthurian legend. "It's really wonderful," he said, "how the whole thing hangs together, even in a late version like Mallory's. You've noticed how there are two sets of characters? There's Guinevere and Lancelot, and all those people in the center, all very courtly and nothing particularly British about them. But then, in the background, on the other side of Arthur, so to speak, there are all those dark people like Morgan and Morgause, who are very British indeed, and usually more or less hostile, though they are his own relatives, mixed up with magic. You remember that wonderful phrase, how Queen Moran set all the country in fire with ladies that were enchantresses? Merlin too, of course, is British, though not hostile. Doesn't it look very like a picture of Britain as it must have been on the eve of the invasion?" "How do you mean, Dr. Dimble?" said Jane. "Well, wouldn't there have been one section of society that was almost purely Roman, people wearing togas and talking a Celticized Latin, something that would sound to us rather like Spanish and fully Christian? But farther up the country, in the out-of-the-way places, cut off by the forests, there would have been little courts ruled by real old British underkings, talking something like Welsh and practicing a certain amount of the Druidical religion." "And which would Arthur himself have been?" said Jane. "That's just the point," said Dr. Dimble. "One can imagine a man of the old British line, but also a Christian, and a full-trained general with Roman technique, trying to pull this whole society together and almost succeeding. There'd be jealousy from his own British family, and the Romanized section, the Lancelots and Lionels, would look down on the Britons, and always that undertow, that tug back to Druidism."
So there's a lot here. I just want to include a little bit of it because I've listened to lectures, and it seems that a lot of the lecturers don't understand the significance of Merlin, and they just they find it's maybe fun, or they think it's completely unnecessary in the book and shouldn't have been put in, and that sort of thing. And the thing that I'm going to explain further as we go a little more in, but the thing about this story is that, King Arthur is supposed to be defending the Welsh people against the Anglo-Saxon invasion, which I don't know the details of the story, but the thing that C.S. Lewis is setting up here in terms of these two opposing groupings is that you have the Welsh that are associated more with the Druidical religion, and then you have the Anglo-Saxons that, as you will see in later on, they're kind of representative of also a kind of black magic and sorcery. And Merlin is an interesting character because he's like a part of that grouping, but he's not hostile to the Welsh because they're typically hostile to the Welsh. And also it seems that he has a druidical influence, which is also bizarre for his background, and that ultimately his magic, it's not really clear basically how Dr. Dimble is talking about it, whether he was like a good or a bad guy, the way that they're setting it up here, but that there's definitely these two different sides. Yeah, it's hard for me to explain myself because I'm not super familiar with it, but it's going to become more clear as we go further, I promise.
And where would Merlin be? Yes, he's the really interesting figure. Did the whole thing fail because he died too soon? Has it ever struck you what an odd creation Merlin is? He is not evil, yet he's a magician. He is obviously druid, that he knows all about the Grail. He's the devil's son. But then Layamon goes out of his way to tell you that the kind of being who fathered Merlin needn't have been bad at all. You remember, there dwell in the sky many kinds of wights. Some of them are good, and some work evil. It is rather puzzling. I hadn't thought of that before. I often wonder, said Dr. Dimble, whether Merlin doesn't represent the last trace of something the later tradition has quite forgotten about, something that became impossible when the only people in touch with the supernatural were either white or black, either priests or sorcerers. What a horrid idea, said Mrs. Dimble. Anyway, Merlin happened a long time ago, if he happened at all, and he's safely dead and buried under Bragton Wood, as we all know. Buried, but not dead, according to the story, corrected Dr. Dimble.
So again, this white and black magic, C.S. Lewis actually writes about this in his book. It's an academic book of English literature in the 12th century. And he's basically making the point that during the medieval times, they thought and communicated, and their relationship with so-called reality was very different with how we now think about reality or facts, and how we associate with like what is scientific and what is not scientific after, you could say, the Enlightenment and how science was revolutionized into modern science. Again, this is brought up in detail in part 1. So in the medieval times, they didn't really have, first of all, a word for science, and magic was kind of in the realm of what was the sciences. And C.S. Lewis brings this up as well in the Abolition of Men, which is very much, an addendum to That Hideous Strength, which is a lecture that he did. So anyone who's confused on that, I highly recommend that they read the Abolition of Man, because it's much easier and more straightforward to understand than all of this this kind of referencing that C.S. Lewis is making. If you don't understand the references, it can seem really odd. So the white and black magic, you could say, is kind of like the good and the bad sciences, for lack of better words. And so in our age, we could still, you could say, the way I'm starting to understand it is that anyone who is in support of the natural law, the laws of creation, you could say is a white magician. Anyone who wants to oppose, to change, to thwart the laws of creation would be practicing black magic. And that's why it's often also associated with like satanic arts, right? Because that's what the essence of the idea of Satanism is that it's in opposition to the laws of creation. And so it's not really clear, right, where Merlin is fitting in. And again, he was just making the point that the people on the Anglo-Saxon side were more representative of this kind of black magic. Now, again, I don't know enough of the details to know the background in all of that. And again, it's very important to understand this whole Welsh versus Anglo-Saxon history, because the Welsh history in Britain, it is a very controversial thing, and there has been a lot of, mistreatment and burying of the history of the Welsh people. So this is a different section. Oh, right. And just to make a note as well that we realized with Jane having all of these dreams, she is a descendant of the Tudor family, which I think C.S. Lewis is he's adding a lot to this, but he doesn't go any further than that. But that, that kind of fits into this vein. The next scene is Mark is having a conversation with Busby and Curry, who are, you can say, part of the inner circle at Bracton College, the progressive element. And Lord Feverstone is present at this conversation, and they're all talking about what they think NICE is going to offer for the revolution in science that they all very much want.
I agree with James Busby, said Curry. The NICE marks the beginning of a new era, the really scientific era. This is going to put science itself on a scientific basis. The findings of each committee print themselves off in their own little compartment on the analytical notice board every half hour. A glance at the board shows you the policy of the whole institute actually taking shape under your own eyes. There'll be a staff of at least 20 experts at the top of the building working this notice board in a room rather like the tube control rooms. It's a marvelous gadget. It must have cost $500,000. They call it the pragmatometer. And there, said Busby, you see again what the Institute is already doing for the country. Pragmatometry is going to be a big thing. Hundreds of people are going in for it. I think, said Mark, that James touched on the most important point when he said that it would have its own legal staff and its own police. The real thing is that this time we're going to get science applied to social problems and backed by the whole force of the state, just as war has been backed by the whole force of the state in the past. One hopes, of course, that it'll find out more than the old freelance science did, but what's certain is that it can do more.
So you can see here the kind of, so again, every inner circle is going to have their own philosophy that C.S. Lewis is geniusly laying out for us. And he just understands what governs and causes these people to tick so well. And I mean, it's hilarious. Like this is the ideal in the world of Curry and Busby is the pragmatometer, pragmatism. And this is what they think they're working towards as the overall goal of this partnership with NICE and the scientific revolution that they're going to be bringing forward. As you see, Mark has said something quite different in that, which is that he thinks that it's the enforcement of these ideas that we can now apply to social problems, and we can back this with the whole force of the state. And I realized with what I was saying about the Tavistock Institute before, so you have the Tavistock Clinic that existed in the 1920s, as Matt said, but that was a clinic for experimentation. Once the Institute was established in 1947, that is the very thing that C.S. Lewis is talking about here, which is now it's about the application of these ideas into society, whether society wants it or not. And we're going to see in the next slide, Lord Feverstone is very impressed with Mark's answer.
Divine, also Lord Feverstone, the main question at the moment, which side one's on, obscurantism or order, to take control of our own destiny. If science is really given a free hand, it can now take over the human race and recondition it, make man a really efficient animal. If it doesn't, well, we're done. You'll hear Curry or James burbling away about the war against reaction. It never enters their head that it might be a real war with real casualties. It is just seriously beginning. They know now that we have at least got real powers, that the question of what humanity is to be is going to be decided in the next 60 years. They're going to fight every inch. They'll stop at nothing. They can't win, said Mark. We'll hope not, said Lord Feverstone. I think they can't. That is why it is of such immense importance to each of us to choose the right side. If you try to be neutral, you become simply a pawn. The practical point is that you and I don't like being pawns, and we do rather like fighting, especially on the winning side.
As you see here, this whole like outlay that this 60 years mark, which again, this book was published in 1945, and James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, which I also wrote a paper on that. People can look at it, look it up on Substack. He goes over what the vision is for. He has several different, options, but they're all kind of going in the same direction, but they're different roads to the same destination. And the managerial revolution, I mean, I think that's has its obvious implications in a technocratic world, which we are very clearly living in increasingly more and more. And these are the sort of ideas that are being promoted. It's very interesting that James Burnham published this book around the same time as C.S. Lewis, again, showing that C.S. Lewis was very astute in what he had. Him and Tolkien, I think, very, very much had their finger on the pulse, and they decided to address these things. Again, remember in part one, it ends with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien pretty much, because Tolkien's supposed to be ransom, that they're basically saying that this is a real fight. They made up this kind of fiction in order to get people to sort of understand it in a way where their minds wouldn't just outright reject it, because reality can be stranger than fiction sometimes, right? And so he kind of lays out this mission for what people who will understand will naturally orient themselves in opposition to this sort of thing, is what, again, refer to part one if you want to know more about that story. And so Lord Feverstone is the new inner circle now that Mark has entered. And just, a few days before, he was so ecstatic to have Curry and Busby, talking to him as one of their own, as a part of the group. And then when Lord Feverstone is there, they're easily made to look ridiculous and, not really intelligent or not really understanding the next secret. There's a deeper secret. There's another group that they're not invited into. And so Lord Feverstone's philosophy is now representing this next step in the inner ring. This is Lord Feverstone that's continuing to talk.
The third problem is man himself. Man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest, which is another reason for cashing in on it as soon as one can. You and I want to be the people who do the taking charge, not the ones who are taken charge of, quite. What sort of thing do you have in mind? Quite simple and obvious things at first. Sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backward races. We don't want any dead weights. Selective breeding. Then real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean one that has no take it or leave it nonsense. A real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents, a real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. Of course, it'll have to be mainly psychological at first, but we'll get onto biochemical condition in the end and direct manipulation of the brain. But this is stupendous, Feverson. It's the real thing at last, a new type of man, and it's people like you who've got to begin to make him.
So you see that we've now moved on to the ideal is no longer pragmatism. It's this sort of sterilization of the unfit. We're going to have this, pure super race, and we're going to be able to have an education now where any of the ideas that you don't like are going to be removed, basically, from society. And at first it will just be psychological, but then we're going to be able to have a biochemical method for this. Again, very brave new world type outlook. This is Mark that continues.
That's my trouble. I don't think it's false modesty, but I haven't yet seen how I can contribute. We want you to write it down, to camouflage it. Only for the present, of course. Once the thing gets going, we shan't have to bother about the great heart of the British public. We'll make the great heart what we want it to be. But in the meantime, it does make a difference how things are put. For instance, if it were even whispered that the NICE wanted powers to experiment on criminals, you'd have all the old women of both sexes up in arms and yapping about humanity. Call it re-education of the maladjusted, and you have them all slobbering with delight that the brutal era of retributive punishment has at last come to an end. Odd thing it is, the word experiment is unpopular, but not the word experimental. You mustn't experiment on children, but offer the dear little kiddies free education in an experimental school attached to the NICE, and it's all correct.
On a note on this, Aldous Huxley and Krishnamurti started a school for children of this sort that I think was called the Happy Valley School, very creepy, and later on was named for what it truly was in support of, Annie Besant. So basically, C.S. Lewis is very aware of all of these ideas that he's bringing forward are ideas that are being brought into society during his time that are still kind of on the new side, whereas now we don't even, really think about it as bizarre. Many people have become very much adjusted to this new way of thinking. But at the time, especially during C.S. Lewis's lifetime, this was still very much considered a battlefront. And some people that the audience should be aware of are T.H. Huxley, who was a proponent of Darwinian evolution. And this really was at the core of what revolutionized the ideology, you could even say religion of modern science, the new religion. And it was very much responsible for two major shifts in modern science, what was then to be modern science, which was that nature, or we could say the universe, was no longer thought to be governed by purpose, but rather randomness. And that number two, man was but a beast, no longer to be among the children of God, no longer regarded as partaking in anything that was divine or sacred. And that, depending on the interpretation, that we also wouldn't be able to know truth at this point. So the kind of investigation towards truth became much more mathematical based, but anything that partook in philosophy, metaphysics, and all this now was regarded as useless. And what you see is that from T.H. Huxley, these aren't all of the names, but this is a very main vein to the kind of thoughts, the kinds of consequences of what C.S. Lewis is laying out in That Hideous Strength, which we see very clearly in the world we live today. And C. Lloyd Morgan, who was a ethologist, that's with like experimenting on animals for animal behaviorism, I believe, and was a psychologist. He was a student of T.H. Huxley. And another thing people need to know, T.H. Huxley wasn't actually, he did not think that Darwinian evolution was correct, yet he promoted it anyway. You can see already what kind of person he is. And so it's not a contradiction that his student, C. Lloyd Morgan, attacked the Darwinian natural selection. He came up with the theory of emergent evolution, which C.S. Lewis brings up in part 2, Paralandra, with the scientist Weston, who is basically becomes possessed by the devil. And emergent evolution is the theory that Morgan came up with. He also created an experimental approach to animal psychology, which is now known as Morgan's canon, and is a principle that played a major role in behaviorism, insisting that higher mental faculties should only be considered as explanations if lower faculties could not explain a behavior. Morgan also appears to be in connection with Cecil Rhodes. This is what Matt told me with just a quick search, but I haven't had time to look into it further. So emergent evolution is the hypothesis that in the course of evolution, some entirely new properties such as mind and consciousness appear, but it doesn't really explain how these things occur. And C.S. Lewis mentions élan vital, which is also a current that is parallel to this emergent evolution idea, which basically is talking about spontaneous morphogenesis of things in an increasingly complex manner. It is, translated as well as the vital force, and anyway, there's a whole big thing on that. And C.S. Lewis makes the character Weston describe emergent evolution in Paralandra as the unconsciously purposive dynamism. So for those who watched part 2, you'll have an understanding of what are the consequences of an emergent evolution philosophy, because Weston was the product of that, and we went through that in detail in part 2 for anyone who's interested. H.G. Wells is another person. He was mentored by T.H. Huxley, and then H.G. Wells in turn worked closely with Julian Huxley, the grandson of T.H. Huxley. They collaborated on the science of life. What H.G. Wells said was part of the New Bible series, and this was a pro-eugenics work among other things. And he also had a lot of influence over the philosophies and writings of Aldous Huxley. For instance, Wells's door in the wall had a strong influence over Aldous's doors of perception, and there are many other references, which again, I've written about, people can find on my Substack page. Julian Huxley was the founder of transhumanism, which coincided with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. It appears they were coming up with it separately, which is interesting. Unless Matt, you know more about that. What was the name of the paper that you did on this? You did 2 papers, right?
Yeah, I did.
What are the titles?
I will put it in the chat box, but it's Julian Huxley's transhumanism, and yeah, I'll put it in the chat box.
Okay, well, it's just for people who are listening on YouTube. I wanted you to say it out loud, but anyway, it'll be in the description box.
I forget the title. Sorry.
He served as president and vice president as well of the British Eugenics Society. He was the first director general of UNESCO, and he wrote their mandate, which included, "It will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake so that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable." So these are very real currents that have real consequences in C.S. Lewis's world and our world as well. And again, for people who want to know more, they can check out my article or my paper, "Who Will Be Brave in Huxley's New World, The War on Science in the 20th Century Descent of Man," as well as "Why H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come Has Arrived Today." Right, so before we read this quote, Miss Hardcastle, so Lord Feverstone is now bringing Mark to the NICE Institute, which is it's also called Belbury. He's now being introduced to this next inner ring, which is within the NICE Institute. And one of the characters he meets there is Miss Hardcastle, also known as the Fairy, which is probably in reference to the fact that she's masculine and is lesbian, but maybe not, maybe there's another reason. And she's also head of the NICE police. She's also a sadist and she likes to torture people. C.S. Lewis writes, she had been at different times a suffragette, a pacifist, and a British fascist, which if you know how these things work, that actually is not a contradiction in titles. Actually, Annie Besant is a good example of someone who has that kind of resume. Okay, you can go ahead, Hugh.
Mark gathered that for the Fairy, the police side of the Institute was the really important side. It existed to relieve the ordinary executive of what might be called all sanitary cases, a category which ranged from vaccination to charges of unnatural vice, from which, as she pointed out, it was only a step to bringing in all cases of blackmail. As regards crime in general, they had already popularized in the press the idea that the Institute should be allowed to experiment pretty largely in the hope of discovering how far humane remedial treatment could be substituted for the old notion of retributive or vindictive punishment. That was where a lot of legal red tape stood in the way. But there are only two papers we don't control, said the Fairy, and we'll smash them. You've got to get the ordinary man into the state in which he says sadism automatically when he hears the word punishment. And then one won't have carte blanche. Mark did not immediately follow this, but the Fairy pointed out that what had hampered every English police force up to date was precisely the idea of deserved punishment. For desert was always finite. You could do so much to the criminal and no more. Remedial treatment, on the other hand, need have no fixed limit. It could go on till it had effected a cure, and those who were carrying it out would decide when that was. And if cure were humane and desirable, how much more prevention? Soon, anyone who had ever been in the hands of the police at all would come under the control of the NICE. In the end, every citizen. And that's where you and I come in, Sonny, added the Fairy, tapping Mark's chest with her forefinger. There's no distinction in the long run between police work and sociology. You and I have got to work hand in hand.
Yeah. So again, this remedial treatment has no fixed limit. It could go on till it had effected a cure. And those who were carrying it out would decide when that cure would arrive. So again, the Tavistock Clinic and MK Ultra is also the product, the kind of baby of the Tavistock Clinic as well, right? Everything that MK Ultra is because of the Tavistock Clinic, and very much was working with that. They were not separate from each other. And, you know, for those who don't know anything about this, again, refer to the papers of both myself and Matthew. And William Sargent was doing experimentations even on soldiers during World War II. And William Sargent was someone who was in close communication with Aldous Huxley as well, which again, I've written about, but we don't have time to go over here. Oh, you can go ahead, Hugh.
Okay. I don't see how one's going to start a newspaper stunt, which is about what that comes to, without being political. Is it left or right papers that are going to print all this rot about Alcazan? Both, honey, both, said Miss Hardcastle. Don't you understand anything? Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and a fierce right both on their toes, and each terrified of the other? That's how we get things done. Any opposition to the NICE is represented as a left racket, in the right papers and a right racket in the left papers. If it's properly done, you get each side outbidding the other in support of us to refute the enemy's slanders. Of course, we're non-political. The real power always is. Mark, give me a real place in the sociological department and I'll... Fairy, rats! That whole department is going to be scrapped. It had to be there at the beginning for propaganda purposes, but they're all going to be weeded out. Mark, but what assurance have I that I'm going to be one of their successors? Fairy, you aren't. They're not going to have any successors. The real work has nothing to do with all these departments. The kind of sociology we're interested in will be done by my people, the police.
So they're trying to get Mark to become a writer for NICE because they realized that one of the qualities that they wanted from Mark was his writing capability. And Mark is a little bit offended because he takes himself serious as a sociologist, which you can see is a little bit of a fraud of a science, at least with the way that the characters in this book are treating it. And you can see all of the ill uses that sociology has claimed to back through science in terms of societal reform. Right. And so the next one, it's another discussion about the whole newspapers and how the newspapers work, but it's a different scene. And they're basically now asking Mark to write about riots that haven't yet happened in Extau.
We could not delay it if we wished, said Strake. What are we talking about? Said Mark. The disturbances at Edgestall, answered Feverston. Oh, I haven't been following them very much. Are they becoming serious? They're going to become serious, Sonny, said the fairy, and that's the point. The real riot was timed for next week. All this little stuff was only meant to prepare the ground. But it's been going on too well, damn it. The balloon will have to go up tomorrow or the day after at the latest. You mean you've engineered the disturbances? Said Mark. The stuff must be all ready to appear in the papers the very day after the riot. That means it must be handed in to the DD by 6 tomorrow morning at latest. But how are we to write it tonight if the thing doesn't even happen till tomorrow at the earliest? And everyone burst out laughing. You'll never manage publicity that way, Mark, said Feverston. You surely don't need to wait for a thing to happen before you tell the story of it.
So yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. And we're finding out that NICE is their police force is now, I don't know if it's at this point, but soon after, if not, they are becoming the official police, because the way that they're writing this in the newspapers too is that the real police are not able to handle the riots very well, and so they need this kind of more professional, more well-trained division, police force division, which is the NICE Institute's police force. So now they have become the police of Extau. And you also realize that it was NICE that organized the riot so that their police could have control. And there's also other emergency protocols that are now being brought forward in the town so that there's all of this red tape cutting that's occurring from the NICE Institute because of these engineered disturbances. And part of it has to do with the mass construction workers of sketchy people that they've brought into town, which are creating a lot of disturbances.
This was the first thing Mark had been asked to do, which he himself, before he did it, clearly knew to be criminal. But the moment of his consent almost escaped his notice. Certainly, there was no struggle, no sense of turning a corner. For him, it all slipped past in a chatter of laughter, of that intimate laughter between fellow professionals, which of all earthly powers is strongest to make men do very bad things before they are yet individually very bad men. And then, too, for a man whose writings had hitherto appeared only in learned periodicals, or at best in books which only other dons would read, there was an all but irresistible lure in the thought of the daily press, editors waiting for copy, readers all over Europe, something really depending on his words. The idea of the immense dynamo which had been placed for the moment at his disposal thrilled through his whole being.
So again, C.S. Lewis talks about this in his lecture titled The Inner Ring, how someone is gradually corrupted by desiring constantly to be in that inner ring, which is kind of an addiction, because once you're in the inner ring, you always need to search for the next inner ring, right? Until like you're at the top kind of fantasy. And once you're in the inner ring, you're always also, for a certain amount of time, the illusion, the prestige of the whole thing you see is not actually as prestigious as you thought, but you always think that it's going to be there in the next inner ring. And so he's conflicted here, but he also has this feeling of increased power that he's receiving from it. And so he's unable to resist, presently, at least at this point. Now, ransom finally comes into the story, which for those who followed part 1 and part 2, you're going to know who ransom is. And if you don't, it's not necessary. I'm not going to go into it because I don't have time. But ransom is now being called the Fisher King, which is connected to the Arthurian legend. Remember that in part 2, he was wounded by Weston, who was possessed by the devil, or was pretty much the devil at that point, had taken over him. He had bit Ransom's heel really badly, and the wound was always bleeding. And basically the wound has never healed. It's just constantly bleeding, but also it's creating a lot of pain for Ransom. And the Fisher King always has this reference as well to the wound. The Fisher King is also supposed to be the last in a long bloodline charged with keeping the Holy Grail. And I don't know details of this, so I can't be super helpful. I'm just bringing them up to help people a little bit in following along with what C.S. Lewis is attempting here. In some Welsh and Breton tales and poems that date from before the famous work of Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century Historia Regum Britanniae, which is what seems to be the main thing that has created the King Arthur stories. Arthur appears either as a great warrior defending Britain from human or supernatural enemies, or as a magical figure of folklore, sometimes associated with the Welsh underworld. So that Arthur existed before this famous work by Geoffrey Monmouth in already the Welsh and the Breton folk tales. So it's not clear if Arthur existed or not. There's a lot of controversy over this. I don't know enough to say anything. Arthur is a central figure in the legends making up the Matter of Britain. The Matter of Britain is the body of medieval literature and legendary material associated with Great Britain and Brittany, and the legendary kings and heroes associated with it, particularly King Arthur, is one of the 3 great Western story cycles recalled repeatedly in medieval literature, together with the Matter of France, which concerned the legends of Charlemagne, and the Matter of Rome, which included material derived from or inspired by classical mythology. And again, you know, the historical King Arthur, it's believed, led the Welsh resistance against the West Saxon advance. So regardless of whether it's true history or not, it's definitely highly influential to the cultural identity of the people. So that is something that we need to keep in mind.
They would say that you do not fail in obedience through lack of love, but have lost love because you never attempted obedience. I thought love meant equality and free companionship. Ha! Equality. Equality is not the deepest thing, you know.
Okay. So as I was saying, C.S. Lewis has a lot of things that he's bringing into this book. It's very challenging to do a class on this, to do service to everything. And this is going to be a bit of a segue, but it is a main theme in That Hideous Strength, which is this question of what is a healthy marital relationship between a husband and wife, which, of course, the theme of C.S. Lewis's sci-fi trilogy is about how to form a healthy society. And he's addressing it in what he believes to be the main veins, the main channels. And most certainly, family structure is a big component to what is going to form a healthy society. So according to the lessons of That Hideous Strength, the reason why Jane and Mark are having marital problems is because Jane has to learn obeisance, to obey Mark. And Mark's lesson is that he needs to rebel. He needs to rebel from the desire to be in the inner ring. And that this desire for the inner ring is also sort of a lust that has taken over Mark, right? Which the lust for power, right? The lust for the esoteric, which has caused problems for Mark's ability to have a healthy relationship with Jane. So I'm going to try to go over this quickly, but I do find that I kind of have no choice. I would have ignored it if I didn't think it was such a big problem, especially because I've listened to lectures of That Hideous Strength. And obviously, you know, there's a strong Christian current throughout this series, and there are a lot of Christian lecturers who are talking about this. And, you know, I've listened to one with a pastor, I've listened to one who is a professor of a Christian school, and they basically just summarize this section, which I don't even think does C.S. Lewis credit, because I don't think it's that simple, that the lesson is the woman should submit to the man. And obviously, that's a very loaded sentence, and they kind of just leave it as that, and they repeat it, you know, it's just, and they move on, kind of thing. So I'll say a few words first about, I don't really have time to say much about Lewis. I mean, people should know that he was an atheist, you know, up until about his 30s, and then he converted to Christianity, but he had several stages with this. And C.S. Lewis described himself as very, you know, he's a very argumentative and strong opinionated person. He likes, you know, to debate. And he described his conversion to Christianity as he was the unlikeliest convert who was brought in, you know, kicking and screaming. I'm paraphrasing, but it's along those lines. And the reason why Lewis is bringing up this, and why, you know, these Christian lecturers are saying that the women must submit to the man, is because, you know, it's written in the Bible. And I'll read this section out, Hugh, because I'm probably going to be talking in between, where it says in the Ephesians, and just to be clear here with this mini segue, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the Bible in talking about this. It's a very sensitive subject, but I think that, you know, it'll be important to hear everything that I'm talking about, and then, you know, have judgment on what I'm attempting to do here. So Ephesians says, give way to one another in obedience to Christ. Wives should regard their husbands as they regard the Lord, since as Christ is head of the church and submits to Christ, so should wives to their husbands in everything. So they're basically saying, right, that the wives should regard their husbands as they regard the Lord, pretty much, right? And if you are submitting obedience to Christ, and your husband is, you know, a kind of reflection of that to you on earth, that you should obey your husband in everything. It goes on to say, husbands should love their wives just as Christ loved the church and sacrificed himself for her to make her holy. He made her clean by washing her in water with a form of words, so that when he took her to himself, she would be glorious, with no speck or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and faultless. In the same way, husbands must love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man to love his wife is to love himself. A man never hates his own body, but he feeds it and looks after it. And that is the way Christ treats the church, because it is his body. And we are its living parts. For this reason, a man must leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one body. This mystery has many implications, but I'm saying it applies to Christ and the church. To sum up, you too, each one of you, must love his wife as he loves himself, and let every wife respect her husband. Now, as you can see, a large chunk of that is not actually so bad. It's really the starting line, and maybe this whole like you need to clean the woman to make her holy is maybe not necessary to be saying that, but it's really that everything is contingent though upon this first rule, which is that wives should submit to their husbands. And I just want to share with you another passage from the Bible, which is from Peter, which says, slaves must be respectful and obedient to their masters, not only when they are kind and gentle, but also when they are unfair. You see, there is some merit in putting up with the pains of unearned punishment, if it is done for the sake of God. But there's nothing meritorious in taking a beating patiently if you have done something wrong to deserve it. The merit in the sight of God is in bearing it patiently when you are punished after doing your duty. So, it's saying, right, that slaves should obey their masters, and even if their master is unfair, and that if you are beaten because you've done something wrong, well, and you're bearing it patiently, that's not anything, honorable or noble on your part, because you deserved it. Where is the merit? Where is the nobility or the grace in it? Is that you bear your punishment when you didn't deserve it, when you did your duty. Very controversial passage. And I'm not saying that the Bible condones slavery, but as you can see in this passage, it certainly doesn't oppose it either. So I would say in our day and age, most of us would regard this sentence as wrong. We reject this instruction, right? Today, we view slavery as something that is not to be tolerated in any form. However, this is a very new development when looking at the span of most of human civilization. For most of human civilization, slavery has existed. It's only until really relatively recently, and even then, we still have forms of slavery. It's just not outright physical, type of slavery. It's other forms, but we are still supposed to regard it as wrong. The Bible does not, to my knowledge, anywhere say that slavery should not exist or that all men are created equal, as stated in the second paragraph of the United States Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because the Bible is so vague on the matter of slavery, there have been many who have interpreted it as condoning the use of slavery, such as this passage, which is, it speaks for itself. It would be hard to think otherwise. And even though the Bible at times addresses slaves directly, as if a slave were reading the Bible, most slaves were not permitted to read the Bible. They were simply told that God had ordained this special relationship between master and slave. So you can see why those in the South of the United States, for example, truly thought that they had God on their side. Why shouldn't they think such a thing? We can understand why great men such as Frederick Douglass had major issues with the teachings in the Bible. So how are we to resolve this? Can it be resolved? Clearly, we should not be reading the Bible such that we are following its instructions word for word. That is, you cannot follow the New Testament as if it were simply instructions that you need to follow word for word. Not even the most artful interpretation can justify such a passage as this one. It is just plain wrong. So why was it written down at all? And I would say that what we need to keep in mind is that the New Testament when it was written, was very radical for its time, and it was calling for certain reforms in society towards a betterment of society. But you obviously can't ask people to be an ideal, not even in our society today where we consider certain things wrong. Could we all of a sudden take the skip next to the ideal, the expectation to be perfect in every way? So I think that, they were laying out instructions that were still quite radical and asked for a great deal of reform, but the institution of slavery was something that was a really big thing for centuries. I mean, it still exists. It's not so easy to just ban it with words. And I think that is sort of the approach that was taken. You can say that if you were to follow the instructions of the Bible, you would find slavery wrong. But honestly, with passages like this, it is, I would say, rather confusing. But at least, they're not encouraging you to exploit people past the whole master slave. Like, you should be a good master to your slave, but it's problematic, right? So it's only been fairly recently that we have a recognized political freedom for all members of society. For most of human civilization, this has not been the case. And this is also political freedom for women. We've reached a point where we can begin addressing the next steps towards a more perfect union, because this is an achievement. Even though it's not a perfect, political freedom, it's a step forward. We don't live in an age where marriage has more to do with economics than it did about love. We live now in a time where women can be independent. They can have their own jobs. They can go to university. They don't need to rely on, their father, their brother, their husband, their son, or so forth, to protect them, to defend them, to finance their living, which was a reality for most of human civilization. And there are good men. I'm not saying that there are not good men that upheld that in a very respectful manner. But for most of history, marriage was more of a contract. Love was really not a big thing when it came to marriage. Whereas now we're living in a world where we have the luxury, where we don't have to worry about day-to-day survival, basically the average person, that's what it comes down to. And we can marry for love. We can marry for choice. You choose your partner now based on their merits, and not based on the need to start a family, to kind of have laborers on a farm or this sort of thing. And I think that, by speaking in the old way, it doesn't help with this whole Western society right now, with the battle of the sexes, which is getting worse and worse, because it honestly should be at this point a relationship that is harmonious and not a power struggle. And I would say, instead of discussing who submits to whom, we should think about approaching it as a partnership. Two people who love each other, they will respect each other. If they choose to have a child, they will want to both be a part of that child's life in raising that child in a partnership. It's not that, it's one person's job over the other. And if they do not have a child, their relationship should not be considered barren if they are committed to something larger than themselves in service to society. That is also a worthy contribution. That is also a worthy partnership to have in society. And thus the main lesson here is, don't marry someone you don't truly love and respect. And we have the luxury now where we can decide that, because if you don't marry someone that you love and respect, you'll obviously have an unhappy marriage. You'll need to, and it will break down into power politics. And I would also add, I won't go on after this, don't worry, that even though it says, the whole wives should submit to their husbands and everything, if as a woman you want to, I would not use the word submit, but you want to follow your husband as a leader, that is also fine, because we all need leaders in our lives. We need leaders in society for society to function. That's not a bad thing. I would just say that, women who want to choose that, rather than, I would say, like more of a partnership that you want to have more your husband leading, which again, you have the right to question, it's not submit in everything, is that it's your responsibility to choose a good man to follow. Because if you choose a bad man to follow, that is still a part of your responsibility, that you have chosen that sort of path. And I would just lastly add that this paragraph is actually not as bad once you get past the second sentence, because when I hear these lecturers like this pastor, this Christian professor at a Christian school, just summarize this as wives should submit to their husbands. I don't think that they're actually being honest about what this passage is actually saying, which is that husbands must love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man to love his wife is to love himself. I understand this as a rather platonic message, because if you love someone as you love yourself, they're no longer considered a possession. They are no longer considered something that you can do whatever you want with, because they are now an extension of yourself. You wouldn't want to hurt yourself. Why would you want to hurt, you're an extension of yourself? And that this is platonic also in the sense that Plato brings up the whole master and servant relationship, which we all have within ourselves, right? We have to be master over our lower desires and so forth. And you could kind of think about it, because it says later on too, right, that they are to become one body. They're to be joined. So you could kind of think about it in that sense as well. But again, it's like it with that kind of outlook, it's much more harmonious. It's not so much about power politics or just, domineering over someone. And then lastly, I would also say, because C.S. Lewis it doesn't do a terrible job in That Hideous Strength, trying to address this. But I think that he himself probably would have rephrased, not done it quite the same way that he did in 1945, because he was single for most of his life. And he only met the women that he would fall in love with in 1952. So, he's 47 at the time of writing That Hideous Strength. He marries Joy David Min in 1956. So he's 58 at the time. And the true marriage is in 57. And this was the first time that Lewis had a profound love for a person, an actual relationship, which was filled with a lot of pain as well, because she had been diagnosed with terminal bone cancer, which is very painful. And he writes in one of his letters, describing Joy, she was my daughter and my mother, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign, and always holding all these in solution, my trusty comrade, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier, my mistress, but at the same time, all that any man friend, and I have good ones, has ever been to me, perhaps more. So I think that summarizes it nicely in terms of how C.S. Lewis himself had kind of come back to that subject. And then moving on to where we were at before that. It's sorry for the segue, but it's just I've heard so many lectures that have, I think, really oversimplified it, and I felt like I needed to say something about it, especially since it's a major theme of this book. Hugh, take it away. Oh, right. Sorry. Before you do. So this is Philostrato is one of the other scientists at the NICE Institute. And he is describing his philosophy of like what he views is the purpose of all of this, which is very much along the lines of a kind of H.G. Wells outlook that we discussed in The First Men in the Moon in part 1, which is again, like Philostrato thinks that the artificial world is a superior world where, everything can be perfected in an artificial world and nothing ever dies. And then they're looking at the moon, and, Mark thinks that the moon is empty with no life. And Philostrato's talking about, no, there's life on the moon. And he pretty much describes, the H.G. Wells setup. Again, C.S. Lewis referencing H.G. Wells's outlook.
We unfortunately lost Hugh to a family event for Father's Day. However,
okay.
Dan or Jerry or somebody could possibly do it.
No problem. Or
Yeah,
you, Matt. Okay, Jerry, go ahead.
I can do it. No, there is life there, referring to the moon. That was Philostrato. Do we know that? Asked Mark. Oh, see, intelligent life under the surface, a great race, further advanced than we, an inspiration, a pure race. They have cleaned their world, broken free almost from the organic. But how? Asked Mark. They do not need to be born and breed and die. Only their common people, their canaglia, do that. The masters live on. They retain their intelligence. They can keep it artificially alive after the organic body has been dispensed with. A miracle of applied biochemistry. They do not need organic food, you understand. They are almost free of nature, attached to her only by the thinnest, finest cord. This institute, it is for the conquest of death, or for the conquest of organic life, if you prefer. They are the same thing. It is to bring out that cocoon of organic life which sheltered the babyhood of mind, the new man, the man who will not die, the artificial man, free from nature. Nature is the ladder we have climbed up by. Now we kick her away. And you think that someday we shall really find a means of keeping the brain alive indefinitely? Asked Mark. We have begun already. It's the head himself. Yeah.
So we find out that Mark is going to be meeting the head that evening. Jerry, just read a little bit faster because we have a lot to go through still.
Okay. It is the beginning of man immortal and man ubiquitous, said Strake. Man on the throne of the universe. It is what all the prophecies really meant. Philostrato. Those who are selected for eternal life. You know as well as I do that man's power over nature means the power of some men over other men, with nature as the instrument. There is no such thing as man. It is a word. A king cometh, said Strake, who shall rule the universe with righteousness and the heavens with judgment. God, said Mark, how does he come into it? I don't believe in God. But my friend, said Philostrato, does it follow that because there was no God in the past, that there will be no God also in the future? Don't you see, said Strake, here in this house, you shall meet the first draft of the real God. It is a man, or a being made by man, who will finally ascend the throne of the universe and rule forever.
So yes, Strake is another member of NICE, and he's a sort of kind of militant Christian fanatic. So yeah, Mark ends up meeting the head, and it turns out the head is quite literally, a head that's attached to all of these wires, and it's like, drooling, and there's a voice that comes out of it. And so according to Philostrato, who's supposed to be in charge of like the sterility of the room and all of the pumps and levers and dials and everything that you have to set up, they have to put artificial saliva through so it can speak and all of this. He believes that it's the microbes that are speaking, that are he believes he believes that it's the head. He believes that it's the head that's actually speaking. So they have like Alcazan's head, but he's like, because he's past death, there's this kind of, I don't know, intelligence, mystical intelligence behind the whole thing. And Jane has a dream where she actually sees Mark confronting the head and everything. And Mark, you know, is obviously very disturbed and creeped out by this, but he does not have a strong foundation and is still kind of trying to get his bearings. He doesn't, his immediate reaction is not to try to leave, because he also knows that he can't really leave at this point anyway. He's in too far. They're probably going to kill him. There was another person too that was murdered, you know, who tried to leave. And McPhee, who is one of this grouping in the Ransom group. So Ransom's group, who are the good guys in this, they're kind of like this diverse misfit type group of like normal common people. And McPhee just writes, the first thing that would occur to boys like them, because they're discussing how this head, because Jane describes this dream, they're wondering if it's real or not. McPhee says the first thing that would occur to boys like them would be to increase its brain. They'd try all sorts of stimulants, and then maybe they'd ease open the skull cap and just let it boil over, as you might say. That's the idea, I don't doubt. A cerebral hypertrophy artificially induced to support a superhuman power of ideation. Again, clear reference to H.G. Wells's The First Men in the Moon, which you see on the right side, which was really obsessed with size of head as equal to intelligence. And right, so now we see that Jane is also starting to have dreams of Merlin. And I think I'll just have Jerry read it and then discuss it.
But from Jane's dream of the cold sleeper, he, Ransom, Fisher King, had learned better. It was something much more definite, something located under the soil of Bragdon Wood, something to be discovered by digging. It was, in fact, the body of Merlin. Merlin had not died. His life had been hidden, sidetracked, moved out of our one-dimensional time for 15 centuries. But under certain conditions, it would return to his body. Not all times outside the present are therefore past or future. There was no doubt now that the enemy had bought Bragdon to find Merlin, and if they found him, they would reawake him. The old druid would inevitably cast in his lot with the new planners. What could prevent his doing so? The physical sciences, good and innocent in themselves, had already, even in Ransom's own time, begun to be warped, had been subtly maneuvered in a certain direction. Despair of objective truth had been increasingly insinuated into the scientists. Indifference to it and a concentration upon mere power had been the result. Babble about the élan vital and flirtations with pan-psychism were bidding fair to restore the anima mundi of the magicians. Dreams of the far future destiny of man were dragging up from its shallow and unquiet grave the old dream of man as God. The very experience of the dissecting room and the pathological laboratory were breeding a conviction that the stifling of all deep-set repugnances was the first essential for progress. And now all this had reached the stage at which its dark contrivers thought they could safely begin to bend it back so that it would meet that other and earlier kind of power.
So that might be a little bit difficult for people to follow, because again, you have to kind of understand the backdrop of what is actually in the works in the real world that we are living in. And again, C.S. Lewis is using, you could say, the extravagant, the fantastical as like metaphors and references to this. So this despair of objective truth created in scientists where they became indifferent to it and just focused on mere power as a result. We already discussed what élan vital is in association with emergent evolution, so we have a bit of an idea of that. And basically what he's trying to say is that the I don't know if I am going further into this in the next slide. I might want to explain it in the next slide. I do. So he keeps going on about this, and then I'll explain further what actually, no, I'll explain it now. Or no, I guess I explain it later on because I don't have my notes with me. That this whole vein with T.H. Huxley, there is also this other wave that is occurring that has this look into parapsychology, mysticism, the esoteric, which I think I scheduled to talk about that later on. So, but just keep that in mind. So that's what he's talking about in terms of these scientists. Like we went from like rejecting the old in modern science, and we're supposed to be like very fact-based and very empirical and data sets and blah blah blah, but then we started to want to reach back for the old power and combine the two, and this is what these kinds of scientists at the Nice Institute are interested in. You can go ahead, Jerry.
Indeed. They were choosing the first moment at which this could have been done. You could not have done it with 19th century scientists. Their firm objective materialism would have excluded it from their minds. And even if they could have been made to believe, their inherited morality would have kept them from touching dirt. It was different now. Perhaps few or none of the people at Belbury knew what was happening. But once it happened, it would be like straw in fire. What should they find incredible, since they believe no longer in a rational universe? What should they regard as too obscene, since they held that all morality was a mere subjective byproduct of the physical and economic situations of men? The time was ripe. From the point of view which is accepted in hell, the whole history of our earth had led up to this moment. There was now at last a real chance for fallen man to shake off that limitation of his powers which mercy had imposed upon him as a protection from the full results of his fall. If this succeeded, hell would be at last incarnate.
So again, as we're going further into the inner rings, we're going to realize that what Philostrato thinks is, his science around the head and everything is not actually reality. So we're getting several people, like Lord Feverson, to his idea of what the Nice Institute is doing, even with his concept of sterilization and eugenics and the creation of the Übermensch and all this. This is also not, the full reality, the full scope of things, right? So we're getting further and further into the what seems to be the ultimate inner ring, and we're realizing there's all of these levels of what people are believing who are involved in the project, and none of them actually know what the point is of what they're involved with. And C.S. Lewis is making the point that they might not be involved, they might not be aware of it, but once they're confronted with it, they would be like straw in fire, because they would not be able to oppose whatever it ultimately was anyway, ideologically, morally, because they had already allowed themselves to no longer believe in a rational universe, no longer in a universe with purpose, right? So nothing could be too obscene, nothing that would be a breach of morality in such a universe where there is no purpose, and that there is no love as well in such a universe. So Mark is now having a conversation. So we see that Wilkins is Philostrato's assistant. Strake knows a little bit more than Philostrato, but it's ultimately Frost and Wither who are the top scientists at NICE, who are the inner circle. So now Mark is having a conversation with Frost about what is the head.
The head, said Mark. No, Philostrato and Wilkins are quite deceived about the head. They have indeed carried out a remarkable experiment by preserving it from decay. But Alcazan's mind is not the mind we are in contact with when the head speaks. Do you mean that Alcazan is really dead? You have probably not heard of macrobes. Below the level of animal life, we have long known that there are microscopic organisms. I have now to inform you that there are similar organisms above the level of animal life. When I say above, I am not speaking biologically. I mean that it is more permanent, disposes of more energy, and has greater intelligence. The macrobe is more intelligent than man. In the light of what we now know, all history will have to be rewritten. The real causes of all the principal events are quite unknown to the historians. That indeed is why history has not yet succeeded in becoming a science. A large, unintelligent population is now becoming a deadweight. The real importance of scientific war is that scientists have to be reserved. The effect of modern war is to eliminate retrogressive types, while sparing the technocracy and increasing its hold over public affairs. In the new age, what has hitherto been merely the intellectual nucleus of the race is to become, by gradual stages, the race itself. You are to conceive the species as an animal which has discovered how to simplify nutrition and locomotion to such a point that the old complex organs and the large body which contained them are no longer necessary. That large body is therefore to disappear. Only a tenth of it will now be needed to support the brain. The individual is to become all head. The human race is to become all technocracy.
So again, very insightful considering where we are at today. And I would, right, so we realize with the understanding of Frost and Wither, they believe that this head that is, Philostrato thinks that it's a head that he has actually preserved, and Alcazan's mind was what was speaking in the head. Frost and Wither are under the impression that it's these organisms called macrobes. It's not clear how they first came into contact with these macrobes that told them to do this, right? And they're invisible. You can't see them. Just like microscopic organisms are invisible, so are the macrobes. But the macrobes have actually, they're superior to humans. They're more intelligent. And it turns out that they have really been shaping our history more than we realize, such that our history actually needs to be rewritten because we have not understood the real causes behind any of the principal events that we thought we understood. And this is also why he says history has yet to become a science. And again, I would say that this kind of philosophy is connected to emergent revolution and élan vital in terms of like this kind of idea of the spontaneity of how change works. And for the second paragraph, this whole thing of like the unintelligent population is now becoming a deadweight. Harari basically says that like verbatim. This is a certain theory that is being very pushed very heavily in the transhumanist currents right now that have a lot of influence in the Great Reset agenda, that they are not making that secret. They are announcing it to the public somewhat openly. And again, recall, I believe we read a quote, right, where these things had to be kept secret for a certain amount of time until they were ready to be implemented. And then the hearts of the British people in this case we would control them. So you see, they're able to talk about these things in a very public way today. And how many people are actually aware of it, or if they are, really even know how to think about the consequences of such a planning for the future. And C.S. Lewis very clearly understands where this current was headed already in 1945 when he wrote this. And that, yeah, the ultimatum is to have a lot less people on Earth, and the people that we do have, it will be the mind, that will be like the culmination of it. It won't be so much the body anymore. You can go ahead, Jerry.
I see, said Mark. I had thought, rather vaguely, that the intelligent nucleus would be extended by education. Frost, the great majority of the human race can be educated only in the sense of being given knowledge. They cannot be trained into the total objectivity of mind, which is now necessary. They will always remain animals, looking at the world through the haze of their subjective reactions. It has served its function by acting as a kind of cocoon for technocratic and objective man. Now, the macrobes and the selected humans who can cooperate with them have no further use for it. The last two wars, World War I and World War II, then, were not disasters in your view? On the contrary, they were simply the beginning of the program. The first two of the 16 major wars which are scheduled to take place in this century. For here surely at last, so his desire whispered to him, was the true inner circle of all, the circle whose center was outside the human race, the ultimate secret, the supreme power, the last initiation.
And again, James Burnham also talks about this in his Managerial Revolution, the plan for about that number 16 major wars that were scheduled for to take place in that century. Yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward. So we'll move on to the next slide, where now Dr. Dimble, who, he's the guy that's always been talking about the Arthurian legend. He's now talking about what Merlin, pretty much what C.S. Lewis wants Merlin to represent in That Hideous Strength.
Merlin is the reverse of Belbury. He's at the opposite extreme. He is the last vestige of an old order in which matter and spirit were, from our modern point of view, confused. For him, every operation on nature is a kind of personal contact, like coaxing a child or stroking one's horse. After him came the modern man, to whom nature is something dead, a machine to be worked and taken to bits if it won't work the way he pleases. Finally came the Belbury people, who take over that view from the modern man unaltered and simply want to increase their power by tacking onto it the aid of spirits, extra-natural spirits. Of course, they hope to have it both ways. They thought the old magia of Merlin, which worked in the spiritual qualities of nature, loving and reverencing them and knowing them from within, could be combined with the new geoteia, the brutal surgery from without. No, in a sense, Merlin represents what we've got to get back to in some different way.
And Goetia, I don't know how to say it properly, is an ancient Greek for sorcery. So again, keeping in mind this whole black and white magic that I was discussing before, and that, what he's saying, we've lost something with the development of modern science. It's not that all of modern science is bad, by the way. It's just saying that, as we can even see during our time, what has become the focus, what has become the priorities, and the selected problems of society and the solutions, it's all out of whack. It's all really misdirected. And we've kind of lost our compass at this point. And C.S. Lewis is saying that in order to find our compass, in order to be more whole, because we've lost a part of ourselves too, culturally, is that we need to return to something, not like exactly, right? You can never return to the past, but we need to remember something that we've lost from the past and bring it forward with us. And that Merlin is a kind of representation of something that we have lost, but it's not exactly Merlin that we want back either, right? He's saying it's a representation of it, but it has to come back in a different way. So he's even realizing there needs to be a qualitative upshift of this thing that we have lost from the past, which you could describe again as white magic. This is the part that I wanted to say about the whole T.H. Huxley crew, right? So they like to play these games, right? Bertrand Russell too, and what's his name? I'm forgetting his name now. But they all like to be on teams, and then they change teams, and they act like they're disagreeing with each other and all of this. But in reality, they're all on the same team. And I think one really good example of this is Aldous Huxley and Julian Huxley, who are brothers. They clearly get along. They clearly respect each other, and they're ultimately on the same page. But they're both representative of completely different, you would think, philosophies or things that they're into. Where Julian Huxley is more this kind of modern science, rigorous bent, whereas Aldous Huxley, went more into the parapsychology, more into the supernatural, and this hocus pocus, type thing, and doors of perception, again modeled off of H.G. Wells's Doors in the Wall. And an interesting thing people should be aware of is that T.H. Huxley's close associate on Darwinism, Alfred Russel Wallace, was one of these people, the new breed, scientifically testing psychic powers, along with William Crookes, F.W.H. Myers, and the renowned psychologist William James, which is also a big influence with Aldous Huxley. And he mentions it in his Brave New World, and I believe he mentions him often enough. And their efforts to develop rigorous tests of mediums, telepathy, materializations, and this led to the founding, this grouping, Wallace, Crookes, Myers, and William James, led to the founding of the Society of Psychical Research, the Theosophical Society, and their American branches. And parapsychology was becoming really big during this period, including during Lewis's lifetime. And Aldous Huxley and Gerald Heard were very much into this when they arrived in the United States. Apparently, the first place they went to as a scheduled visit was the California Parapsychology Institution in San Diego, I believe, which is what is the institution in the Ghostbusters movie. So they're like really into this. It's interesting, right? That like you have this whole modern science revolution where now science is going to be fact-based, empirical, and all that, but you also have these currents of the supernatural that are already almost immediately being brought into that in certain groupings. And they claim that they don't really like each other, but that's all bunk. They're working with each other. And it's because they recognize that there is something of the old order, but they have a corrupt view of it. And I know I'm being very vague because I myself have to do a lot of work with this, so I myself cannot explain it very clearly. So in the story, Merlin, who awakes, he actually shows up of his own accord, because the Nice Institute, Belbury, that's why they bought Bragdon Wood. They wanted to awake Merlin because it wasn't clear whose side Merlin was going to be on. Was he going to be the white magic, or was he going to be the black magic? And so Merlin wakes up on his own, and he shows up to Ranson's headquarters, which is a house. It's not intimidating looking building. And Ransom knows the old solar language, and Merlin instantly knows that Ransom is sort of like the king on Earth. He's like the Fisher King, and he recognizes him as a king. And there's references to Numenor and all of this for people who are familiar with Tolkien. C.S. Lewis was giving a bit of a hint to this sort of thing. But again, it shows too how much Lewis and Tolkien were very much on the same page in terms of what they were trying to intervene on, although they took, you could say, different stylized ways of expressing this in literature. And so the Nice Institute at Belbury, they also think that they have captured Merlin, but it turns out that they've captured a tramp, and this tramp is refusing to talk to them, and they're trying to like get someone who can speak Latin, so that they can communicate with what they think is Merlin. I don't think that this is a necessary slide. We're going to skip it. So we end up where Merlin, long story short, is hired as the translator by the Nice, because they put it out in the newspaper, right? We need a guy who can speak Latin. And so it's Merlin who applies for the job, and no, they can speak Latin, but the tramp can't understand it, and they need someone else who can speak this other language, which I forgot now what it was. So anyway, Merlin is the translator, and he comes to the Nice Institute, and he's basically puts the tramp into like a hypnotic state, and he's like claiming that he's saying all of these things to pretend that he's the real Merlin. And they're all going to head to this dinner at Nice where they're going to now showcase this Merlin character, what they think is a Merlin character, to the audience. And Jules, Mr. Jules, who's supposed to be the head of the institute, I think it's very clear again that Lewis is doing a bit of a dig to H.G. Wells, because he describes Jules as someone who is difficult, because he regarded himself as the actual figurehead, the real director of the institute, when he was really just the public face. He was described as a little man whose legs are so short that he was unkindly compared to as a duck. And his novels had first raised him to fame and affluence. Later, as editor of the weekly called We Want to Know, he had become such a power in the country that his name was really necessary to Nice, which again, H.G. Wells was a journalist he worked for the Ministry of Propaganda, literally, writing books, H.G. Wells. And he did write as a journalist under Lord Northcliffe, who was the owner of the Times and the Daily Mail, the two biggest British newspapers at the time. So they come to dinner, and Jules is talking, and all of a sudden everyone is like starting to look at him very weirdly, because they're realizing that his words are not actually making any kind of sense. And then I think it's like Wither who steps up, and he doesn't know what's going on with Jules and everything, and he tries to smooth it over, and he's talking to everyone, and he realizes that they're also looking at him weirdly, and he actually turns out is not making any sense. And Merlin has kind of like done a spell on the group where basically nobody can understand the other person. They're all speaking nonsense, which again is like a reference to the Tower of Babel being the curse of the Tower of Babel being unleashed onto the Nice Institute. And then it happens that this is the whole thing. There is a bear called Mr. I forgot his name. He's on the good guy's side, and he long story short, he ends up also at the Nice Institute, and the animals are freed. And so the animals end up in this dining room, and they basically eat most of the people. But Wither and Frost escape, so do Lord Feverstone. But pretty much everyone else dies in that. Some other people escape. And at this point, it's not looking good. They realize that Merlin was actually the translator, And Lewis is just describing the kind of inner dialogue now that's going on in the minds of Wither and later on in the mind of Frost, in terms of how their philosophies have really blinded them to a choice that is still before them. They can make a choice to not carry out on the path that they are on, and yet they choose to carry on that path, regardless of the obvious doom ahead of them. You can go ahead, Jerry.
It is incredible how little this knowledge moved him. It could not, because he had long ceased to believe in knowledge itself. What had been in his far-off youth a merely aesthetic repugnance to realities that were crude or vulgar had deepened and darkened year after year into a fixed refusal of everything that was in any degree other than himself. He had passed from Hegel into Hume, thence through pragmatism, and thence through logical positivism, and out at last into the complete void. The indicative mood now corresponded to no thought that his mind could entertain. He had willed with his whole heart that there should be no reality and no truth. And now even the imminence of his own ruin could not wake him. The last scene of Dr. Faustus, where the man raves and implores on the edge of hell, is perhaps stage fire. The last moments before damnation are not often so dramatic. Often the man knows with perfect clarity that some still possible action of his own will could yet save him. But he cannot make this knowledge real to himself. Some tiny habitual sensuality, some resentment too trivial to waste on a blue bottle, the indulgence of some fatal lethargy seems to him at that moment more important than the choice between total joy and total destruction. With eyes wide open, seeing that the endless tear is just about to begin, and yet, for the moment, unable to feel terrified, he watches passively, not moving a finger for his own rescue, while the last links with joy and reason are severed, and drowsily sees the trap close upon his soul. So full of sleep are they at the time when they leave the right way.
And that's what he means, they leave the right path. So I think that's pretty straightforward. So the next scene is Wither, Strake, and Philostrato have survived the dining room massacre. By the way, these animals are the animals that they were doing experimentations on, the ones that were healthy enough to actually escape. So Philostrato is ushered into the room with the head by Strake and Wither, and he's like freaking out because they've just immediately rushed into the room before any of the sterilization practices have occurred, or he didn't set the dials or anything, and he thinks that this is going to, ruin the head, and obviously the head won't be able to work without all of these little gadgets, and he's surprised with horror that the head speaks, without any of this fidgeting. You can go ahead, Jerry.
No one had read the dials, adjusted the pressures, or turned on the air and the artificial saliva. Yet the words came out of the dry, gaping mouth of the dead man's head. A door, it said. He, Philostrato, was compelled to bob up and down in rhythmic obeisance, the others meanwhile doing the same.
By the way, they had stripped naked before, and now they're bobbing up and down.
God. Almost the last thing he saw on earth was the skinny folds of Wither's neck shaking like the wattles of a turkey cock. Almost the last thing he heard was Wither beginning to chant. Then Straight joined in. Then horribly, he found he was singing himself. Our Borundra, our Borundra, our Borundra Babahi. Another, said the voice, give me another head. Philostrato knew at once they were going to murder him uselessly, unscientifically. God.
Right. So what happens after that scene? So Philostrato, they have a guillotine there in this sterilization room for, it was supposed to be for other uses or whatever. So Philostrato is decapitated, and then Wither and Strake are also bobbing in front of the head, and then it occurs to them that the head is probably going to ask for another head, and so they start to battle it out. And Wither succeeds in killing Strake. He murders him, but he's unable to remove his head. And Wither, for the whole time, like, Wither is not quite himself, and I'll explain shortly why he's like always seems to be not really in this world. And so after he murders Strake, he picks up the head of Philostrato to offer it to the head, and he sees something move in the adjoining room where he had murdered Strake, and he sees that there is a great bear, and it's rising on its hind legs with a gaping mouth, its eyes flaming, its forepaws spread out as if for an embrace. And Withers thinks, was this what Strake had become? He knew, though even now he could not attend to it, that he was on the very frontier of a world where such things could happen. So it's again just showing you how the philosophy of rejecting a certain kind of reality makes you open to almost anything at a certain point. So he's like, well, I logically I could explain this in the frontier of the world that I'm upon, that Strake's murdered body has now just transformed into a bear. We obviously know what the next scene is, which is that the bear, Mr. Buttlebee or something like that, he kills Wither, and we realize that it was not even this concept of the macrobes that was causing the head to speak, and what was also kind of giving the instructions to Wither and Frost, but it was in fact, you could say, the devil and evil spirits. And recall for part 1 and part 2, this Lewis explains the setup. It might sound like it comes out of left field here if you don't know about those other books, but Earth is supposed to be the silent planet. It's the planet that has been taken over. Every planet has their own Oyarsa kind of guardian angel, and the devil is the bad. Oyarsa has turned bad on Earth, and it's become silent to the communication of the heavens. Right. And it's kind of like a siege type situation. And so these scientists who thought that they were being super scientific and whatnot, and thought that they were, communicating with the superior macro type species, were actually being possessed by evil spirits, according to this story. So this is, now we're going to follow what happens to Frost after the dining room massacre.
Frost had left the dining room a few minutes after Wither. He did not know where he was going or what he was about to do. For many years, he had theoretically believed that all which appears in the mind as motive or intention is merely a byproduct of what the body is doing. But for the last year or so, since he had been initiated, he had begun to taste as fact what he had long held as theory. Increasingly, his actions had been without motive. He did this and that, he said thus and thus, and did not know why. His mind was a mere spectator. He could not understand why that spectator should exist at all. He resented its existence, even while assuring himself that resentment also was merely a chemical phenomenon. The nearest thing to a human passion which still existed in him was a sort of cold fury against all who believe in the mind. There was no tolerating such an illusion. There were not and must not be such things as men. But never until this evening had he been quite so vividly aware that the body and its movements were the only reality, that the self was a non-entity. How infuriating that the body should have power thus to project a phantom self. Thus the Frost, whose existence Frost denied, watched his body go into the anteroom, watched it pull up sharply at the sight of a naked and bloody corpse. The chemical reaction occurred. Frost stooped, turned the body over, and recognized Strake. He hardly noticed that Wither and Philostrato lay there dead. Of Alcazan's head, he found no trace.
And that's because the bear pulverized it, we can assume. So we go on with Frost's inner dialogue, I guess.
Still not asking what he would do or why, Frost went to the garage. He came up with as many petrol tins as he could carry. He piled all the inflammables he could think of together in the objective room. Then he locked himself in. That tiresome illusion, his consciousness, was screaming in protest. He poured out the petrol and threw a lighted match into the pile. Not till then did his controllers allow him to suspect that death itself might not, after all, cure the illusion of being a soul. Nay, might prove the entry into a world where that illusion rage infinite and unchecked. Escape for the soul, if not for the body, was offered him. He became able to know, and simultaneously refused the knowledge, that he had been wrong from the beginning, that souls and personal responsibility existed. He half saw, he wholly hated. The physical torture of the burning was hardly fiercer than his hatred of that. With one supreme effort, he flung himself back into his illusion. In that attitude, eternity overtook him as sunrise in old tales overtakes trolls and turns them into unchangeable stone.
Mm-hmm. So while this is all occurring, you have earthquakes, floods that are happening, and basically the whole town of Extau falls into a sinkhole. And we are followed along with Lord Feverson is one of the guys who survives the dining room massacre, and he gets into a car and he's driving, and it turns out that Merlin was hiding in the back seat because I guess Merlin didn't know how to drive, and so he was just controlling Feverson to drive it in a certain direction until he met his horse and galloped off. And but Lord Feverson crashed the car as a consequence of all this. So he's walking down the road, he's trying to get back to Extau, and everyone is headed in the opposite direction. Everyone's fleeing from the town because it's absolute mayhem that's going on. And he reaches the town just in time for the whole thing to collapse into a sinkhole, and he's sucked down with it. And so that's the end of Devon. And I would say it's pretty obvious. Oh, never mind. Sorry, I thought there was another slide. So this is the kind of ending that we will. I'll choose the end, the story of the book with this quote or excerpt. Go ahead, Jerry.
It all began, said Dimble, when we discovered that the Arthurian story is mostly true history. There was a moment in the 6th century when something that is always trying to break through into this country nearly succeeded. Logres was our name for it. It will do as well as another. And then gradually, we began to see all English history in a new way. We discovered the haunting. What haunting? Said Camilla. How something we call Britain is always haunted by something we call Logres. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. Haven't you noticed that we are two countries? After every Arthur, a Mordred. Behind every Milton, a Cromwell. A nation of poets, a nation of shopkeepers. The home of Sidney and of Cecil Rhodes. Is it any wonder they call us hypocrites? But what they mistake for hypocrisy is really the struggle between Logres and Britain. This haunting is no peculiarity of ours. Every people has its own haunter. There's no special privilege for England, no nonsense about a chosen nation. We speak about Logres because it is our haunting, the one we know about. Those who have forgotten Logres sink into Britain. Beautiful.
Yeah. And again, so what he's saying is that there are two identities within Britain. And clearly, right, they are the nation of the poets. There's a very good history of Britain, but there's also, you know, the not just the history of empire in Britain, but there's something else that, you know, C.S. Lewis is touching upon in this story, and that he's making the point that every country, or you could say every culture, has their own haunting, has their own struggle between this better thing and this worse thing, which, you know, in our day and age, a lot of the worst components, you could say, have kind of taken a driver's seat. And you know, in reference to Matt's series, Clash of the Two Americas, that's precisely what he's referring to as well in the story of the United States, which also has been struggling with these two different identities. And specifically here, C.S. Lewis is talking about two culturally different identities. And I would say the consequence of trying to bury, I guess, some of the Welsh history has been, it seems, harmful. I don't know enough about this. And again, what I was referencing before, that there is something that we have lost in our transition to a more modern society. It's not to say that everything is bad, but we have certainly sacrificed something where, as C.S. Lewis makes the point, and Tolkien too, it's a theme in his work, where nature has become something dead to us. But not just nature, you know, like biology, literally, but the world that we live in, the nature, the universe that we live in has literally become a sort of dead thing. Or as we discussed in part one, the universe has become regarded as a void, emptiness, blackness, something menacing, something hostile, which for most of our human civilization was referred to as the heavens. And it was not regarded in that sort of light. And so C.S. Lewis, basically, in bringing Merlin into the story, is a way to try to invite people to, especially the British people, right, to rejoin something of their lost culture that they have forgotten. And he encourages, you know, other cultures to do the same. But he's obviously speaking to a particularly British crowd with this novel. And so I think it's quite clear at this point what was the point of it being titled That Hideous Strength, where at first you can maybe read that section of Genesis saying, oh, they built a city and a tower that would reach the heavens. Is that supposed to be against science? Is that supposed to be against, you know, industry, to want to advance or push yourselves to a limit? And I would say no. If you regard it from what C.S. Lewis outlays here, it is, you know, when we try to replace the laws of creation, when we try to replace natural law for other things, when we try to put ourselves in that seat, as what was already mentioned, when we try to make man God, when the creator that can change, you know, the constitution of life on earth for whatever reason that you think is supposed to be a better thing, rather than us being more akin to an identity as stewards, as caretakers. And so it's not even to say he's not against science, and it's not even to say that we shouldn't ever go out into the heavens or, you know, go into the galaxy, but we have to be ready. We have to be worthy of that kind of responsibility. And if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you're seeking out that kind of power and influence for the wrong reasons, which we can again use the metaphor of black magic, then you don't deserve it. And basically in this story, it does end with a divine intervention, right, with the earth and the floods, although it's not the end of days. As C.S. Lewis makes the point, we went through in part 2 of Paralandra, it's the beginning. It was Earth failed to begin, and now it can finally begin, now that this hideous strength has been destroyed, at least for Britain, right? And that because these people had challenged, because it was supposed to be right that you weren't going to have divine intervention, but because they challenged the order not only of Earth, but they were going to go out into the universe, and they wanted to spread this philosophy, multiple stage philosophy, which we've gone throughout this lecture series. That was the ultimate breach, which then invited the divine intervention to come crashing down upon X-Tau, specifically in this case. And I read that as I thought I had another slide there, but if you taunt the natural order, it makes sense that the natural order of things is going to it can only be a violation, a form of exploitation that is temporary. You can't permanently upset the natural order. We can progress and advance in harmony with the natural order, but if we try to oppose it, it will crush you. And I would just end with a short excerpt from C.S. Lewis's lecture, The Inner Ring, which was another main theme of this lecture, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
The quest of the inner ring will break your hearts unless you break it. If you break it, a surprising result will follow. If in your working hours you make the work your end, you will presently find yourself all unawares inside the only circle in your profession that really matters. You will be one of the sound craftsmen, and other sound craftsmen will know it. This group of craftsmen will by no means coincide with the inner ring, or the important people, or the people in the know. It will not shape that professional policy or work up that professional influence which fights for the profession as a whole against the public. Nor will it lead to those periodic scandals and crises which the inner ring produces. But it will do those things which that profession exists to do, and will in the long run be responsible for all the respect which that profession in fact enjoys, and which the speeches and advertisements cannot maintain. And if in your spare time you consort simply with the people you like, you will again find that you have come unawares to a real inside, that you are indeed snug and safe at the center of something which, seen from without, would look exactly like an inner ring. But the difference is that the secrecy is accidental and its exclusiveness a byproduct, and no one was led thither by the lure of the esoteric. For it is only 4 or 5 people who like one another meeting to do things that they like. This is friendship.
And yeah, I think that definitely is the message as well from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series as well, and probably has some relationship to this concept of the ring. And I think that that's a very beautiful idea. I know Matt had mentioned that George Orwell had written a review of this trilogy, and he was disappointed with the ending, especially with the divine intervention ending, because it sounds like, you know, what are we supposed to do then if like divine intervention is what the only thing that can destroy at that point such a hideous strength. And I would say that that isn't really the whole point of it. And this focus on the inner ring is actually very much at the core of what most people, their road to corruption is, which is that you're willing to compromise on certain things. I didn't have time to go through this, but Mark did go through a transformation where he realized, you know, that everything he was seeking out in trying to achieve the ultimate esoteric inner ring, the ring of all, right, to rule them all, sort of thing, that it was never, it was becoming more and more clear that it was an absurdity what he was getting into, and that everything he had done to sacrifice to get into these inner rings were things that he didn't want to do. He sacrificed friendships, he sacrificed certain ambitions and loves for things that he wasn't happy to do, but thought it was necessary in order to get into these inner rings. And that's what C.S. Lewis is referencing here. The quest of the inner ring will break your hearts unless you break it. And I think that if people even just take that as a lesson, besides this, the philosophy of the sort of universe, the type of universe that we live in, which is how he ends part 1 too. If I can at least, he says, have people regard space no longer as space, this dead, ominous thing, but rather the heavens, he'll be happy in his book having that effect as an intervention. And with this part 3, I think that he would be happy in the sense of getting people to realize how dangerous the lure of the inner ring is. And that if the average person were to even just take that as the lesson, society would not be able to go along the track where you would have a type of Bellberry Nice Institute, or you wouldn't have, you know, the types of ideas that are being promoted very loudly today. If you were willing to uphold what you had, what you know to be something that is moral rather than something that is compromising in that morality. And you know, it's very common for people to want to boycott things nowadays, but I would put forward how many people have the courage, because it's not easy. It's not just not easy economically. It's not easy, you know, career-wise, if you feel like you've spent years working towards getting to this goal and you realize that the job that you hold is actually doing damage, is a destructive thing upon society. How many people are going to quit their jobs rather than tell themselves, well, at least I won't seek any further in the inner rings, but I'll just stay in this ring and I'll try to minimize my damaging effect. It's not good enough, right? We shouldn't partake in something that we know ultimately is a destructive thing. And we should have the courage to face the consequences. And ultimately, there is always an alternative, and the alternative is most certainly better, as C.S. Lewis makes the point. Lewis and Tolkien most definitely were probably very much, you know, people wanted them in their inner rings. They were very influential. And I think that they did a decent job staying true to themselves and recognizing that friendship was the only inner ring one need seek. And true to your craft.
And true to your craft. Cynthia, I told everyone that their minds would be blown. I don't think I lied in any way. That was just masterful, a wonderful composition, and you wrapped it up together with such a thorough composition. Really great.
Starting pretty wacky.
No, you pulled a lot of moving parts together into a whole. That was good. That was really good. Jerry, I know, had a thought to contribute regarding the figure of Arthur, and I don't know if Jerry, if that's still something you'd like to share or throw out there.
Oh, I'd love to.